Paul McCartney, a music legend who made the Beatles the greatest band of all time. But behind the spotlight are the pains of loss, personal tragedies, and storms that few people know about. Losing his mother at a young age, witnessing the breakup of the Beatles, the deaths of loved ones, and broken marriages. Is this the price to pay for greatness? Let's explore Paul McCartney's ups and downs in today's video. Childhood with the pain of losing his mother. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, in Liverpool, England. In the context of England, still struggling to recover from World War II. His family was a working class, living in a modest house at 20 Forthland Road, which later became a historical landmark associated with the birth of the Beatles. Paul's father, Jim McCartney, was an amateur jazz musician, playing in Jim Mack's jazz band. Although he did not pursue music professionally, Jim had a great influence on his son's love of music. He often played the piano at home, inspiring Paul and his younger brother Michael and encouraging them to practice and compose. Jim was also the one who helped Paul practice his excellent sense of music, a talent that contributed to the creation of a musical genius later. Paul's mother, Mary McCartney, was a dedicated nurse who not only cared for patients, but also provided the family with financial security. Working tirelessly, she ensured that Paul and his younger brother had as stable a life as possible. Although the family was not well off, they were filled with love, with family meals and evenings listening to the BBC, where Paul began to take music seriously. Paul's early years were spent peacefully in a poor but energetic Liverpool. He was an intelligent boy, loved literature, enjoyed reading, and showed a talent for composing from an early age. Although he had never studied music theory, Paul could play the guitar on his own, instinctively. However, his happy childhood was cut short by a heartbreaking event that he would never forget. In 1956, when Paul was 14 years old, his mother, Mary McCartney, was diagnosed with breast cancer. At that time, treatment options were limited, and surgery was the only option. The McCartney family did not have the financial means to access advanced medical methods, and within a short time, Mary died on the operating table, leaving Paul and his family with a great loss. The sudden death of his mother completely changed Paul's life. From a carefree boy, he became more withdrawn and quiet. The lack of his mother's care caused the family to fall into turmoil. His father, although trying to be strong, could not hide the pain of losing his beloved wife. Dinners were no longer filled with laughter, and the small house on Forthland Road became colder than ever. This loss made Paul turn to music as an escape. He began to spend more time with the guitar, writing his first songs to express his feelings. Music gradually became an important spiritual support, helping him overcome the pain. Many years later, when he had become a great artist, Paul wrote the song Let It Be, one of his most famous songs, inspired by the memory of his mother. In a dream, he saw Mary appear and say, "Let it be," as a message to let go of grief and continue living. That song is not only an immortal piece of music, but also a testament to the sacred motherly love deeply engraved in Paul's longing for his deceased mother. The death of his mother was also one of the reasons why Paul later deeply sympathized with John Lennon, who also lost his mother at a young age. Sharing the same pain of losing their mother, they quickly became close friends, sharing not only about music, but also about the hidden corners of their souls. This was also an important foundation that helped form the special relationship between Paul and John, laying the first brick for the birth of one of the greatest bands in the world, the Beatles. The Beatles were not only the greatest band in the world, but also an important part of Paul McCartney's life. However, behind the glory were huge pressures, internal conflicts, and irreparable losses. What caused this legendary band to break up? And how did Paul cope with with the loss of his closest friends. Let's look back at his glorious and tragic years with the Beatles. The Beatles' glorious and tragic years. Paul McCartney met John Lennon and George Harrison as a music-loving adolescent in the late 1950s. Three rock and roll fans promptly formed the Quarrymen and began playing together. The Beatles began in 1960, with Pete Best, later replaced by Ringo Starr, as drummer. The Beatles became famous in the early 1960s after signing with EMI and being managed by Brian Epstein. Love Me Do, Sue, their debut song, was somewhat successful, but the Beatles took off with Please Please Me in 1963. The Beatles became the most famous band in the world by the mid-1960s, starting with Beatlemania. She Loves You, A Hard Day's Night, and Help topped the charts. And so, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967, is regarded as a musical masterpiece. Fame and huge success also put a strain on them. The intensive performance schedule fatigued members. They were now besieged by thousands of supporters everywhere they went. John Lennon and Paul were the principal songwriters. Therefore, Paul was under continual creative pressure. This wore him and the gang down. Internal tensions also arose. Paul and John wrote terrific songs together, but by the late 1960s, their musical tastes split them. Paul preferred sophisticated pop rock, whereas John grew interested in new musical explorations, especially after being influenced by Yoko Ono. George Harrison felt his songs were ignored compared to Paul and John. The Beatles' collapse was inevitable as tensions rose. The Beatles dissolved in 1970, ending a significant musical period. Public outrage and responsibility fell on Paul McCartney. He left the Beatles first and issued his solo album McCartney, 1970, leading many to assume he caused the breakup. Paul was criticized by fans and the media, which drove him to sadness. Although the Beatles broke up, Paul and John Lennon remained connected. However, their relationship changed. They sometimes criticized one another in interviews. Paul composed Too Many People after 1971 to reference John and Yoko, while John posted How Do You Sleep with harsh comments. In the late 1970s, they reunited and occasionally communicated. But on December 8, 1980, catastrophe struck. Mark David Chapman, a fan who had requested an autograph hours before, killed John Lennon outside the Dakota Building in New York. The demise of this legend stunned the globe. When reporters questioned about John's death, Paul said, "It's a drag. He was slammed for being callous to his close friend's death after this sentence." Paul subsequently said he was too surprised to articulate his sentiments. He was in pain, but didn't want the media to know. With sadness and desire, Paul addressed John Lennon in interviews years later. He regretted not saying goodbye to John, one of his biggest regrets. Paul Honored, his old closest friend. With songs like Here Today, 1982, the catastrophe continued. Smoking contributed to George Harrison's 1997 throat cancer diagnosis. George's disease advanced to his lungs and brain in 2001, despite many treatments. Paul visited George at his Swiss residence in his final months. When they reunited, they talked about happy recollections and appreciation rather than their pasts or occupations. Paul subsequently remembered that George had his sense of humor till the end, even though he knew he was dying. George Harrison died at 58 on November 29, 2001. For Paul, this was like losing a younger brother. He said, "I lost a dear brother and buddy. I miss George, and it's hard to comprehend his death." Paul regularly addressed George in concerts and interviews after his death. At George's 2002 memorial event, Paul played something on the ukulele, my favorite instrument, which was emotional. Paul paid respect and showed his affection for the guy with whom he made immortal music. Love can be the most powerful force, but it can also bring profound pain. Paul McCartney's marriage has been filled with both complete happiness and irreparable loss. How did he overcome tragedy and move forward? Tragedy in marriage. Paul McCartney met Linda Eastman, a talented American photographer, in 1967. They began dating shortly after and married on March 12, 1969, just months before the Beatles broke up. Linda was not only his life partner, but also his important musical collaborator. She accompanied him throughout his post-Beatles years, helped form the band Wings, and raised their children with him. Unlike many other famous stars, Paul and Linda had a simple but happy marriage. They were rarely apart, and Paul once shared that in nearly 30 years of marriage, they had only been apart for one night. Linda was the one who brought stability to Paul's life, helping him get through difficult times, from the Beatles' breakup to his criticism by the media. But that happiness did not last forever. In 1995, Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer, the same disease that had taken Paul's mother when he was only 14. For the next 3 years, Paul was by her side, fighting the terrible disease with her. He even bought a farm in Arizona so that Linda could enjoy the fresh air in her final days. However, all efforts were in vain. On April 17, 1998, Linda McCartney passed away at the age of 56, leaving Paul in inconsolable pain. Linda's death caused Paul to fall into a deep depression. He could barely function normally for a long time. In an interview, Paul shared that he felt like he had lost a part of his soul and did not know what to do without Linda by his side. Music, which had been his reason for living, seemed to have lost its meaning. It took many years for Paul to gradually recover, but the pain of losing Linda remained deep in his heart. After Linda's death, Paul lived in loneliness and loss for many years. But in 1999, he met Heather Mills, a former model and charity worker, at a charity fundraising event. Heather had lost a leg in a car accident in 1993, and her story of strength and determination caught Paul's attention. The two quickly fell in love, and in 2002, they married in a lavish ceremony at Castle Leslie, Ireland. At first, Paul and Heather's marriage seemed happy. They often appeared together in public, and in 2003, Heather gave birth to their daughter, Beatrice McCartney. But behind the scenes, their relationship quickly became strained. Heather was heavily criticized by the British media, who claimed that she had only married Paul for his money and fame. Meanwhile, Paul's family and close friends were not entirely supportive of the marriage. Those close to Paul, including his children, did not trust Heather and believed she had personal motives. The conflict between the two escalated, and by 2006, they officially separated. Paul and Heather's divorce became one of the most noisy lawsuits in British history. Heather accused Paul of abusing her during the marriage, but did not provide convincing evidence. In contrast, Heather was criticized by the public for her controversial statements and demands for huge compensation. Finally, in 2008, the divorce was settled, and Paul had to pay Heather nearly £50 million, a figure that caused a lot of press coverage. After this tumultuous marriage, Paul became more private about his personal life and avoided controversial relationships. Despite his deep emotional trauma, Paul McCartney continued to search for happiness. He later married for the third time to Nancy Shevell, an American businesswoman, in 2011. Unlike his previous marriages, this relationship was maintained by Paul privately and stably, helping him find peace in his later years. Have you ever heard the rumor that Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced by someone else? This is one of the strangest conspiracy theories in music history, and it has had the world talking. So where did this rumor come from? And why do so many people believe it? The Paul McCartney is dead rumor. The 1960s were the Beatles' heyday, but one of the oddest conspiracy theories in music history emerged. Paul McCartney died in 1966 and was replaced. In 1969, an anonymous caller to American DJ Russ Gibb said Paul had died in a vehicle accident on November 9, 1966. The band reportedly replaced Paul with a man who looked and sounded like him to avoid offending fans. The tale became viral among US and UK college students. This conspiracy hypothesis used the Beatles' album Evidence. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band 1967 is a wreath-like floral arrangement with Beatles in yellow blossoms on the cover. The band may have done this to covertly acknowledge Paul's death. Paul's clothing also includes a little tag that says OPD, which many assume means officially pronounced dead. Later albums featured the Evidence. In Magical Mystery Tour 7, only Paul wears a black hippopotamus suit. The others wear white, a sign of death. Rewinding Strawberry Fields Forever may reveal John Lennon saying, "I buried Paul." John subsequently claimed he just meant cranberry sauce, but the myth lingered. The Abbey Road, 1969, cover features a famous piece of evidence. The shot of the four members crossing the road shows Paul barefoot, while the others have shoes. This may be the classic funeral image: John Lennon in white, the angel or priest; Ringo Starr in black, the undertaker; George Harrison in jeans, the gravedigger; and Paul, who is dead, shoeless and out of step. Also, the Volkswagen Beetle, parked along the road, carries the registration plate 28IF, 28 if Paul had lived. On his Scottish property, Paul McCartney lived peacefully as the stories circulated. He was absent from the media, so many suspected anything. Paul dismissed the conspiracy claim in a November 1969 Life interview. He frankly said, "If I were dead, how could I be here to answer you?" Many still accept this notion, even stating that William Campbell, a vocalist who looks like Paul, replaced him. The Paul McCartney is dead claim permeated mainstream culture while being false. It appeared in numerous books, documentaries, and TV broadcasts throughout the years. Paul became more renowned because of this conspiracy notion. As Paul McCartney continues to play and write, this unusual myth remains one of the world music's most intriguing mysteries. And as you know, Paul McCartney was not only a genius musician, but also a sharp businessman. However, despite co-writing most of the Beatles' hits, he spent decades without ownership of these songs. One of the most bitter events in Paul's career was losing ownership of the Beatles' music to Michael Jackson in 1985, leading to a decades-long legal battle to get it back. The legal battle. In the 1960s, when the Beatles were just starting in the music industry, Paul McCartney and John Lennon signed a contract with Northern Songs, the company that held the copyright to the group's songs. Initially, they were not too concerned about copyright ownership, as they wanted to focus on writing and performing. However, as the Beatles became more and more successful, Paul and John gradually realized that they did not have control over the music catalog that they had written. In 1969, in an attempt to regain control, Paul McCartney and John Lennon attempted to buy shares in Northern Songs when the company was put up for sale. Unfortunately, they lost to the Associated Television Corporation, ATV, which resulted in them losing all rights to their songs. This became a big lesson for Paul, and he has always been interested in music copyright issues. By the 1980s, Paul McCartney had become a music copyright collector. He owned an extensive music catalog, including songs by many other artists. During this time, Paul and Michael Jackson developed a close relationship. They collaborated on two hit songs, Say, Say, Say and The Girl Is Mine. As they became closer, Paul shared with Michael about investing in music copyright and the importance of copyright ownership. However, Paul did not expect that Michael Jackson would use his advice to buy back the Northern Songs catalog. In 1985, when ATV decided to sell the copyrights to the Beatles' songs, Michael Jackson quickly offered $47.5 million to buy the entire set. When he heard the news, Paul McCartney was extremely shocked and disappointed. He hoped that Michael would cooperate with him to share ownership, but Michael refused all offers. This caused a rift between the two artists, and from then on, Paul never spoke to Michael again. Paul once shared that he felt deeply betrayed. "I thought Michael would help me get back the songs I wrote. Instead, he said, 'This is just business.'" Paul. Michael Jackson held the copyrights to the Beatles' music for many years, using this catalog to profit from royalties. In 1995, facing financial difficulties, Michael sold 50% of the catalog to Sony Music for $95 million, creating the Sony ATV Music publishing joint venture. This meant that Sony controlled the majority of the Beatles' songs, and Paul was still unable to regain ownership. In 2009, after Michael Jackson's death, ownership of the catalog became a complicated issue. Michael's family retained some control, while Sony continued to expand its influence. By 2016, Sony bought out all of Michael Jackson's family's shares, becoming the full owner of Sony ATV Music Publishing. This further weakened Paul McCartney's hopes of regaining control of his music library. However, Paul was lucky thanks to a provision in U.S. copyright law. Under this law, musicians can reclaim ownership of their works 56 years after their release. This means that Paul could file to reclaim ownership of some of the Beatles' songs in 2017. After a lengthy legal battle with Sony, he finally regained control of part of his music catalog. Despite reclaiming some of the songs, Paul McCartney still doesn't have control over the entire Beatles music library. He has expressed regret over his past mistakes, including not paying attention to copyright issues from the beginning. "These are songs I wrote when I was young, but for decades, I didn't have the rights to them. It's unbelievable," Paul said. Paul McCartney, despite still maintaining his passion for music and appearing on stage at the age of over 80, could not hide his lonely moments when thinking about the past. His loved ones, from his ex-wife Linda McCartney to his two close friends in the Beatles, John Lennon and George Harrison, had all left him. Loneliness in old age. The Beatles were not only a legendary band, but also a second family for Paul. However, over the years, he had to witness the departure of two of the most important members of his life. John Lennon, who had been Paul's songwriting partner since the early days, was assassinated in 1980. John's sudden death was a huge shock to Paul, causing him to lose his soulmate, the person with whom he created immortal musical masterpieces. Paul once recalled the moment he received the bad news. "I was at home when a friend called to say John had been shot. I couldn't believe it. I was speechless, not knowing what to do. I had lost a big part of my life." 20 years later, in 2001, George Harrison passed away from lung cancer. Although he knew about George's health condition, Paul was still heartbroken when he passed away. Paul once shared that George was not only an excellent guitarist, but also a close friend who brought calm and depth to the group. "I remember George's last days. We spent time together. We held hands like brothers. It was a very special moment." Not only did Paul lose close friends, but he also suffered the pain of losing his first wife, Linda McCartney, in 1998. Linda was not only his life partner, but also his career companion from the peak of the Beatles to the days when he formed the band Wings. After Linda died of breast cancer, Paul fell into a long-term depression. He could not eat normally, did not want to compose, and lost inspiration for music. In many interviews, Paul still mentioned Linda with all the love and regret. He once said, "There are evenings when I sit alone and think about Linda. I miss the times we wrote songs together, cooked together, and took care of the children. I miss her smile, the warmth and unconditional love she gave me." After Linda's death, Paul McCartney remarried Heather Mills in 2002, but the marriage ended acrimoniously in 2008. The noisy divorce with legal disputes left Paul deeply hurt. It was not until 2011 that he found new happiness with Nancy Shevell, a wealthy and independent businesswoman. Nancy became Paul's spiritual support, helping him balance his life. Although happy with his new wife, Paul still often spent time alone, sitting at the piano, writing music, and reminiscing. Paul McCartney continued to make music, touring and performing in front of thousands of audiences. But when the spotlight went out, he returned to his large house and faced loneliness. In recent years, Paul often mentioned his longing for his deceased loved ones. "Every day I miss John, George and Linda. I always wonder, if they were alive, how would my life be different?" Although he still composes, performs, and contributes to music, the loss in his life inevitably leaves Paul with moments of emptiness. Perhaps that is the common sadness of great artists, those who have spent their whole lives creating and contributing, but, in the end, have to witness their loved ones passing away one by one. Have you ever wondered how music legends like Paul McCartney feel when they look back on a life where glory is always accompanied by loss? If you had the chance to send him a message, what would you say? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more interesting updates. Thank you, and see you in the next videos.